following is a local resident producer's program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Media Services, the City of Oshkosh, or Time Warner Cable.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Oshkosh Diaries. I'm Paul Lesslinger. I'm joined by my co-host Derek Kleiber today. We have an hour segment today, hour-long program. We have two segments. The first segment is, first of all, what is Oshkosh Diaries? We're going to talk about how I came up with the idea, introduce the people that are involved with this show, and we're going to talk about the Oshkosh Memorabilia Club, a club here in Oshkosh that both myself and Derek are involved with. And then the second segment of the show, we're going to be having Brad Larson, director of the Oshkosh Public Museum, come on and talk about Oshkosh from a historical perspective of how Oshkosh got started, why people came here, and going to have a lot of pictures, good pictures. And Brad is an expert in the history of Oshkosh and why people came here. So we'll be happy to have him on for the second segment. So, what is Oshkosh Diaries? Basically, this show is about meeting people that have made a difference over the years in the city of Oshkosh. The people that you'll be seeing on this show could be politicians, activists, teachers, firemen, policemen, community leaders, community cheerleaders, businessmen and businesswomen. All these people are going to be very interesting for some reason or another that you may not know anything about them. And that's why we'd like to have them on the show so we can talk about who they are. And we're hoping to find out what they do in their daily life and what contribution they made to the city of Oshkosh. We'll talk about their childhood and how they became important to Oshkosh. We'll also talk about what is near and dear to them and what's on their mind. If the guest is a senior citizen, what I'd like to do is kind of compare and contrast what that person went through when they were younger, what Oshkosh was like, what they remembered, the things that they did as a child, and what they think of Oshkosh now, and try to compare and contrast that. And we've lost far too many people in Oshkosh, I think, that have great stories to tell. And that's one of the other reasons we want to do this show, to hear those stories. And unfortunately, when I was coming up with this idea, one of the people that I wanted to have on, I was really looking forward to, was Paul Poberezny. And unfortunately, we lost Mr. Poberezny, a few weeks ago. So once he passed away, I realized that we really had to do this show because there's stories to be told. And I'm hoping that you'll enjoy the show. Now, how I came up with the idea. As I mentioned before, along with my co-host, we're a member of the Oshkosh Memorabilia Club, and we love Oshkosh history. My time on the council, I spent 11 years on the Oshkosh Common Council, 2 as mayor. I met several very interesting individuals and got to know them for the job that they did in the city of Oshkosh, whether it be community development or developers. But that was kind of their day job, so to speak, and you really don't know who that individual is on their own time. So we really want to know who the person is, behind the day job. You read about them, you hear about them on the radio, but sometimes you just really don't know who that individual is. So I wanted to pull together a show where those people could just relax and tell the story of who they are and how they got started. We had several different names that came up with for the show. One, I was excited. The first one that I thought of was a person of interest, and I found out that there was a show on CBS that was called Person of Interest, so we had to kind of scrap that idea. One of the other ones was kind of apropos for what we're doing, movers, shakers, and newsmakers, and that got X'd out too. So after getting input from several people, this is the name we came up with, Oshkosh Diaries. With that, As I mentioned, I do have a co-host, Derek Kleiber. I'd just like to take a few minutes and throw it over to Derek and have him talk to you for a little bit.
Right, well, thank you, Paul. Yes, as Paul mentioned, himself and I have a deep love of this community, the history in it. And in talking with Paul when we developed this, there was a very deep void that needed to be filled and to tell these stories. As he mentioned before, a lot of these individuals are no longer with us, and it's quite a shame because the stories that could have been told would have been amazing. And this community that we're very fortunate to be part of is wonderful. It's amazing. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to travel many places, not only in this state, but in this country, and find such a deep-rooted history and sense of community. Just wonderful stories. And as a matter of fact, there's a group on Facebook that's got over 5,000 members, and it's active daily, post upon post upon post of photos, stories from childhood, memories of perhaps teachers from 50, 60 years ago. There's a lot of people in this community that really appreciate the history, and it's our hope to really put this into focus. A little bit about me, born and raised in Oshkosh, 5th generation, educated here, never left, never plan to. I'm just very, very deeply connected to this community. Other than that, hobbies, I have deep love of the history, as I said. I have an extensive collection of memorabilia, as does Paul. Always on the lookout for more, of course, and member of the Oshkosh Memorabilia Club, which does promote and preserve the past of Oshkosh. Really, that's all about me. I think the show is going to showcase a lot more interesting people than myself. So with that, I'll lead it back to Paul here.
Okay, thanks, Derek. With that, I want to talk about the volunteers that we have on the show. 2 of the 3 are with us tonight. One, Amanda, unfortunately, is under the weather, so she won't be with us tonight. But I do want to talk about the other 2 gentlemen. First one up is Daryl Dukacek. He is an Oshkosh North graduate of 1986. And while at Oshkosh North, he worked at the station at the school. And recently, about 3 years ago, he decided he wanted to get back into that line of work. He is a student at Full Sail University, majoring in digital cinematography. I've been a volunteer at Oshkosh Community Media for 2 years. It says his path will lead him one day to the operator of his own digital cinematography business. He enjoys volunteering at Oshkosh Community Media Services and the relationships he has made here. And he hopes this opportunity with Oshkosh Diaries is the next step in a career and success that awaits him. And the next person we have is Ian Bartlett, and he also has volunteered at Oshkosh Community Services. He's been here for about 7.5 years, but his, quote, bread and butter job is at Evergreen Retirement Community. He handles the closed circuit television station there, where he tapes and edits concerts, occasional staff presentations, and other projects. He also helps the staff operate the various sound systems they have installed in the building. And outside of the TV production field, he has a strong interest in visual arts, and he considers himself a music geek and a coffee snob. So those are interesting traits for Ian. And Amanda, who again is not with us, unfortunately, but talk about her for a little bit. She is an Oshkosh North High School graduate of 2013. In school, she enjoyed the music department, was in choir for 4 years, which were Spartan choir, treble choir, and a cappella and choral. Spent 3 years in madrigals and musicals. Took a class in high school that was associated to the TV9 studio, and this is one reason for her interest in media. Her career path will be to follow in the footsteps of her mother. She'll be attending Bella Cosmetology Academy in spring of 2014, and her ambition is to be a massage specialist. And she said, whatever direction I choose, both my parents have been great support staff to my success. So very happy to have Amanda, Ian, and Daryl, and of course, Derek here. We do have a pretty significant list. We've got about 25 people on that list of who we'd like to interview that we believe are instrumental in the city of Oshkosh. But we also want to take input from you. So if you have someone that you feel has made a significant contribution to the city of Oshkosh, we want to hear from you. We want to hear who that individual is and why you feel that they should be interviewed. So you can contact me, you can contact Derek, and give us that name and number. We'd love to talk to you about that. Also like to talk a little bit about the club that we're a member of, as we mentioned before, the Oshkosh Memorabilia Club. We're proud to have them as a sponsor for the show. We meet the third Tuesday of the month at 7 o'clock over at the Oshkosh Senior Center. And it's a group of people of about 30, 40 people that collect historical items in Oshkosh. I collect brewery memorabilia. Derek here collects the old indexes and other items. People collect toys, coins, tokens. What are some of the other things?
Music, milk bottles, extensive advertising collections,
Postcards.
newspapers, pretty much anything Oshkosh. There's somebody in that group who has a wonderful home for it, who would just love it. That's kind of the neat thing. We can kind of bounce things off each other. Maybe I'll find something out at an auction or an estate sale, but I might not collect it. I know somebody who does in the club, and they're much appreciative of it, and kind of do the same for each other. It's a very close-knit group of individuals.
Yeah, and the other thing that we do that has just been a huge success is we put on the Antique Appraisal Show. It used to be the end of March. It's now usually the first Saturday in April, where we have all the people, well, most of the people from our club at the Oshkosh Senior Center, at the Annex, where people come in and we can appraise the items that were made in Oshkosh, or if there were items that were made for an Oshkosh company, people come in and we can appraise those items, and we hear a lot of great stories. Even if people don't have items, they come in and tell us a story about, their walks in the life in the city of Oshkosh, and we just love to hear. We love to hear from them on that. So we will be coming up again in April, and our theme this year, we always have a theme. Last year was Oshkosh Corporation. They had a bunch of items there. This year it's going to be railroads. We're going to be focusing on the railroads that have been in Oshkosh and still are in Oshkosh. So look forward to that in April, and we'll be telling you more about that as the time comes along. The show times for this show, they are set, and those will be Monday at 7 p.m., Wednesday at noon, and Saturday at 5 p.m. This particular show will run for a few weeks. We wanted to get people used to this time slot, and we had some scheduling conflicts of getting some people on. So this will run for a few weeks, and we hope to have our first show with a guest will run hopefully in December. So we should be up and running fully by December. And so with that, I just wanted to say again, stay tuned, because our next segment will be with Brad Larson, the Executive Director over at the Oshkosh Public Museum, to talk to us about Oshkosh, the history of Oshkosh, how it came to be. So with that, I want to thank you for watching this first segment, watching Oshkosh Diaries. Stay with us, and we'll be right back. Thanks.
On the surface, the simple pleasures in life are going on all around us. But inches beneath the surface, utility lines are carrying electricity, gas, and more to your home. Digger's Hotline helps avoid costly or dangerous mistakes. It doesn't matter how deep you're digging. Call 811 or click diggershotline.com 3 working days before you start your project, and we'll help take the risk out of digging. Protect your simple pleasures. Know what's below.
There is a place where history is captured in time, where the voices of past generations still discuss the days of success, of love, hope, and joy. Timeless, playful,
Welcome to my attic.
memorable. The Oshkosh Public Museum. Come for the sights, stay for the memories.
Welcome back to Oshkosh Diaries. For the rest of the show, we're going to focus on the city of Oshkosh, why people came here, who were they, the landmarks, politicians, and some other various items relating to Oshkosh. And with us for the rest of the show is Brad Larson. He's from the Oshkosh Public Museum, and Brad was nice enough to put together kind of a pictorial history of Oshkosh with people and places and whatnot. So with that, Brad, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Okay, so you got why don't we just take a minute here? You got a book, and you want to talk about that and some other things?
Well, I always encourage people to find out about their community, to learn about their community. And you can do that at the museum, of course, but there's also a number of good books out there, and I think that this is probably the best one. It's called Oshkosh at 150. It was originally published in 2003, and there's a second version that was published in 2012. So it's really a great overview of the city. It talks about leaders, it talks about the people of the community. So I encourage people to learn about the place that they live, and this is one really good way to do that.
Okay, and who's the author?
It's Michael Gock. It was a project of the Oshkosh Area Community Foundation and William Haney.
Why don't if we can get that in front of the camera? Yep, there we go.
Very good book. Great overview.
You're going to do it this way? Okay. Sorry about that. So it's got pictures and whatnot in there, but otherwise kind of a history of Oshkosh at 150
It is, and it's
years
the kind of book that you can pick and choose, and you can read chapters and you can read sidebars. You don't have to read it like from start to finish. It's a really easy book to read, and you could pick out people, you could pick out industries, you could pick out recreation, you can pick out sports teams. Best one out there, I think.
Okay. Well, before we get into the pictures here, Brad, I've always told people when I ran for council, my mom and dad lived here, and Derek's lived here all his life. I just have always found Oshkosh to be a fascinating place, and as you probably have heard, being in Oshkosh many years on the city staff, we're always compared to Appleton and Neenah and Fond du Lac and all that. And Oshkosh has its quirks. There's no doubt. We're better and we're worse in some areas, but one thing that I've always said is I just love the history of Oshkosh. And in the museum business, would you say that Oshkosh is full of history?
It is. It's really rich. It's got an incredibly rich and varied history. And every city has got its own little quirks and its background and everything. But Oshkosh is so diverse, and it's had so many leaders. And the city was very important politically. It was very important financially for the state. It was very important socially. Its influence stretched beyond Wisconsin. Its influence stretched to Washington, D.C. So in the 19th century, Oshkosh was a very powerful city, and a lot of people don't realize that. It was incredibly, when people talked about cities in Wisconsin, today you think, oh, Madison and Milwaukee. But in the 19th century, when you were talking about important cities in Wisconsin, you thought Oshkosh.
Well, in our next show, we're going to be talking to Scott Cross, a man that you know very well over at the museum. And I think he's going to be talking about Chief Oshkosh. And now Chief Oshkosh, who the city obviously is named after, actually went to Washington and talked to the President of the United States, did he not?
Oh, he did. And so many people from Oshkosh had influence, political influence in Washington and great economic influence. And that's not just in the 19th century. That stretches into the 20th century. So learning that story and learning those people, I think, is a pretty cool thing. It really enriches your life, and it helps you understand the place that you live. And I think that's a great goal for anybody, to understand how their city works. And when you think about it, we are all heirs to the successes or failures of those that came before us. There's just no way to get around it, whether that's 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 150 years ago. And finding out how we got to this point is a good thing, I think.
Okay. Well, at this point, Brad, what we're going to do is, if the guys in the control room want to start pulling up the pictures, I'm going to kind of turn it over to you. You have 26 pictures, and then you've got kind of a little narrative on the pictures. So if we can get the first picture up on the screen, and Brad's going to talk to us about that.
Well, you can't really talk about the community, I think. You can't really talk about it unless you talk about the Native Americans, the people that lived here first. Because people have lived in this place where we are, where our homes are. There have been people living here for probably 5 or 6 or 7 or 8,000 years. And they picked this place to live for the same reason that our ancestors picked this place to live. And that image on the screen right now is Waukau. He was a Ho-Chunk chief. That's what it's called now, but in the 19th century they would have called them Winnebagos, and that's what the lake is named after. In the next slide, which is which is image 2 there. That's a painting by Gustav Benke. And that painting, Gustav Benke was a German immigrant. He painted a lot of scenes around Oshkosh. And Native Americans would have been so common around Oshkosh in the years before the Civil War. You would have seen them all the time. They would have been in the streets, they would have been paddling their canoes. It just would have been a part of life. And Gustav painted one, that's a painting in the museum's collection, painted one on the shores of Lake Winnebago. It's a pretty cool image.
Brad, before you go on anymore, I just want to ask you, all the pictures that we're seeing here today are in the collection. Are these original pictures that the museum has?
Yes, those are all, everything that people are going to see is in the museum's collections, both the paintings and the photographs.
Are all of them available for public review, or are they in...
Most of them you can get to right actually from the website. A lot of the photographic images you can just click on our website, and then you can get to about 16,000 different images you can look at. The paintings, on the other hand, you would probably have to come to the museum. We have some paintings on the website, but not all of them by any stretch. But certain the photographs that you're going to see are all accessible right through the web.
Okay, all right. Well, then let's continue.
Okay, so the next image, 3, is a painting by J. Frank Waldo in 1885. And the point here is water really defines this community of ours. We're in the state's biggest watershed, 6,400 square miles. Incredible big watershed. And it brought Native Americans here, it brought the early white settlers here, and the early leaders saw that water as a way to develop economically, because water was the way things moved. They moved through steamboats and boats, and everything, whether that was goods or people, moved on the waterways. So it was that location right there on this great big lake, on this water system that stretched literally from Green Bay in the north all the way down to the Wisconsin River. It was the river that brought us. So J. Frank Waldo captured that, and today that 6,400 square mile watershed still really defines our life today, Oshkosh on the water. And the next slide, this is a slide of some of the early settlers, the early leaders. They're the Wright brothers. And yeah, Wright brothers.
Nice picture.
They came here because they saw opportunity. And people have to remember that those early settlers, when they came here, it was largely wilderness. We were still a territory, and these guys came in the late 1830s, 1840s, and they saw opportunity. They saw a way to grow a business, to grow a life, to develop this little spot of land because of its location. It was so perfectly suited.
Now, where were these gentlemen? Where were their houses, or where did they stay? Or
they came from New York State. They were New York settlers, and all the settlement at that time was located around what we call today Main Street. And at that time it was called Ferry Street, because to get across the Fox River, which was the big barrier, how are you going to get across this big river?
Right.
You had to have a ferry. So they lived primarily in this area that we call the downtown today, which of course didn't look anything like it does today. It was
Right.
just houses, and there were even small farms. But they set up businesses, and they set up sawmills. And in the next slide, 5 and 6, the real growth of the city, the real reason that we even have a city here today, is because of wood. And it's not the wood that was here locally. The trees that were growing in the immediate area were almost all oaks and birches and that sort of thing. But what caused the city to grow was the wood from the northern part of the state. And today we owe the fact that we have the city here to the wood that grew up along the Wolf River Pinery. And in this slide it shows lumberjacks with the logs that they've cut, pushing them into the Wolf River. And those logs would be floated down the river. They would be floated down to Lake Poygan and Butamore, which were largely like big holding pens. And then from there, those logs came down to Oshkosh. And when they came down to Oshkosh, they were turned into products. And once that started to happen, the city actually started to build. And in the next image, you can see There's one of the first sawmills in town. This was the Wright brothers, or the Webster sawmill, excuse me, in 1866. And eventually there would be over 40 sawmills that lined the banks of the river.
So where is this at in reference to today?
That would be more toward the northern part of, up along, let's see, where would be, like where the Payne row houses are, up that way.
Okay.
Up that way.
Now I think recently, some dredging attempts have unearthed some of these logs. Have they not?
Yeah, they have.
Now, does the museum have pieces of that?
We have one. It's actually right on the grounds of the museum, and it's part of a sorting pen. And you can actually see the holes in the log. And these big sorting pens, when the logs came down from the northern part of the state, each log was marked by the owner. So it would have a stamp on the end that would identify it. This is Paul's log, and that's Derek's log, and this is Brad's log. And you can imagine as they came down the river, they got all jumbled up.
Yeah.
And so somebody had to sort those things out. So they went to Paul's mill, and they went to Derek's mill, and they went to Brad's mill. And the sorting pens were actually made out of big logs. And what we have on the grounds is part of that sorting pen.
Oh, okay.
That came up out of the muck. And a lot of Oshkosh was built literally on sawdust, because they would take the sawdust from these mills and they would use it as fill. Because especially on the south side of the river, it was really swampy. It was not like the north side, which was higher and had firmer ground. On the south side, it was very low and pretty much swampy right by the river. So they used a lot of that sawdust as fill. Now, of course, sawdust isn't the best fill. We know that today, but in the 19th century,
Yeah.
You're
not building high rises back in the
Right.
1800s in Oshkosh. So, okay.
So the city, in this view here, this is in the 1860s, the city was really taking shape as we know it today. And this is a view of Oshkosh in 1867, 64, excuse me. It really shows the view to the south there. You can see the mills, you can see the river. In the 19th century, those steam or those smokestacks and those curls of smoke, that meant progress. And Oshkosh was really growing, and it was all because of that wood. And that gave economic prosperity to so many people. And the next image, which is image 8, is the first mayor, a guy by the name of Edward Eastman. Now, you can imagine the challenges that this guy had as a leader. He's the first mayor. How do you have a city now that's incorporated in 1853. It's got no infrastructure, it's got no taxing, it's got more people that are pouring in to work in the mills, it's got immigrants coming in, and this guy's got to give the leadership to people.
Yeah.
And has to have the vision to create a community. So Edward Eastman, he had to have a tough job. Let's face it, really challenging job, but
Absolutely.
he did it, and he did it very well. So the next image, we go back to the river, and this is the steamboat Neff. It was painted in the 1880s, and right behind it you can see the first courthouse. So that steeple in the back is right where Court Towers is today, and that steamboat landing was right there where the Leach Amphitheater is.
Okay.
And that was like the center of town, where you got on the steamboats, where you left the steamboats, where you greeted people. That was kind of like the center part of town. And the river was life. Everything focused around that river. Your products came that way. You moved by the river. And for literally over 100 years, the river would be the center of life in Oshkosh. And Oshkosh was not only and economically with the sawmills, but it was also a transportation hub for the whole region. Not just for Oshkosh, but for the whole region. We dominated this whole region, and we actually made steamboats here. We had a very thriving steamboat industry, and that spawned off iron workers, and it spawned off machinists and engineers and foundries. All those people that were necessary to make the steam machinery was all centered here. And the important thing for that is it gave Oshkosh a very diverse economy pretty early on. Mm-hmm. So even though wood was the was like the foundation. It was also very diverse because it had a lot of other things that kind of spawned from that early wood industry, like the steam power.
Okay.
And image 10 shows that there was other industries that came up. Now this happens to be the Oshkosh Logging Tool Company, and it was right downtown. It was on the south side of the river, and it eventually would become Leach Company. And maybe some of your older viewers will remember when Leach Company was actually down by the river, by the Main Street Bridge. It was on the south side right there.
I don't remember that.
Leach Company moved out after World War II, and it moved to the north part of town. But when it first got its start, it made logging tools, and actually it continued to make logging tools well into the 20th century. And this view shows, you can see all the logs piled up there, and it's actually looking toward the lake, and right in the corner there you can just see a little bit of the bridge there peeking out in the corner. And most people, when they think of the history of the city, they think of fires. And in the next image, which is image 11 there, actually here's an image of all the mills. I think this is pretty cool. It shows there Lake Winnebago at the bottom of the screen, and then you can see all the mills that lined the river at one time. So people today, when we say we're going to redevelop the river, we have to remember that we're redeveloping the river on a lot of old brown fields.
A lot of contamination.
A lot of contamination, so it's not as easy as just digging a foundation and there you go.
Right.
And this map really shows that really well.
Right.
So the next image here, let's see what we have. Fire. Fire shaped the community a lot because of all that wood that was around and everything. You can imagine these belching steam engines. They were all full of sparks and everything. So one of the early decisions by the leaders, by the mayors, by the Common Council, actually aldermen at that time, was to create a paid fire department. Very few cities at that time had paid fire departments. It was based on volunteer fire departments more than anything else. And this guy said, no, you absolutely, it's too dangerous to rely on volunteer firefighting companies. We need a paid fire department. Very controversial decision. It really, really was. It was in the 1870s, 1877 I think it was. But he prevailed, and so the city of Oshkosh had one of the very first paid fire departments in the state. Of course, it didn't go over very well with the volunteer companies, but a lot of those volunteer firefighters actually then became
regular firefighters.
Firefighters.
Okay.
So the next image here, what do we have? We talk about the fires. Well, early on, even though the city was made of wood, the downtown that we see today, the ones that you can drive down Main Street, you'll see it's all these great brick buildings, gives the city a lot of character. And we look at it and we can really visualize that 19th century Oshkosh. It's because of the fires that it was made in brick and stone, quarried stone, limestone from the quarries just south of town, and brick. And they began to make a more permanent city. The real heyday of Oshkosh in the 19th century was the 1870s and 1880s. That's when Oshkosh was booming. And in the next slide here, it's the Grand Opera House. Now today we go to the Grand Opera House, we enjoy performances, but in the 19th century the Grand Opera House was a symbol. It was a symbol of Oshkosh's power. And Oshkosh was powerful economically, it was powerful politically, it was powerful socially, and people came to Oshkosh. When they talked about cities in Wisconsin, you think about it today, we say, well, what are your big cities in Wisconsin? And we'll say, well, it's Madison and it's Milwaukee. But in the 19th century, when you were talking about cities in Wisconsin, you would most likely say Oshkosh, because it had so much clout. And people from Oshkosh were politicians that served in Washington. And in one of our next slides here, the next slide is a good example of that. It's Felita Sawyer. Felita Sawyer was called the Grand Old Man of Oshkosh. And he started out his life as mayor, and he was an alderman, and then he became a congressman, and then he became a senator. And that's probably where people remember him most, as Senator Sawyer, the grand old man of Oshkosh. And the important point here is Oshkosh was just this incredible city. I mean, it was just so influential in so many ways. And people said, well, you know, if we're going to do something, we better find out what's happening in Oshkosh first. And I would hope that if your viewers took one thing away from this program, they would remember that with great pride that Oshkosh was once this incredibly good city, very, very economically and politically powerful city.
Right.
So it was in this period of the 1880s that a lot of what we think of the city as we think of the parks, and in our next slide you'll see an image of Menominee Park. A lot of what we see today actually took place during that heyday. Now, Menominee Park was a very controversial decision at the time. People said, well, you know, I'm not sure we want to take this big chunk of land and make a park out of it. I'm not sure that's a good idea. But people had vision, and today I don't think that there's a soul in Oshkosh who would say that Menominee Park isn't our jewel.
Right.
And a lot of the things that we see today actually have its foundation back there in the 1880s, in those great periods of prosperity. And one of the things that led to, and I think people are often amazed at this, and in our next slide we have a sports team. And people say, well, gosh, you know, why would Oshkosh have sports teams? Well, when you have that kind of clout, when you have that kind of economic power, you can do a lot of things. And one of the things that happened in Oshkosh is we had a lot of professional ball teams. And this is a photograph of the Oshkosh Indians in 1911. It's just one of many ball teams. A lot of them were founded by the Sawyers, the same people that brought us the public museum, and the same people that we just saw that slide of Felita Sawyer. Mm-hmm. But there were many, many other athletes that came from Oshkosh as well. And a little bit later we'll look at a sports team from the 1940s. But there were professional golfers that came from Oshkosh. There was a professional speed skater that came from Oshkosh. There was professional boxers. I mean, there's a lot of sports history, athletic history that's focused right here in our town, and it all came because some of the decisions that were made, you know, that enabled this all to happen, and that's what happens when a city is successful. There's a lot of things that begin to happen because of that.
Absolutely.
So anyway, I've been just talking. So to catch up, any questions? So
no, I'm just enjoying it so far.
Oh, that's good.
Very much so.
Okay. The next slide here is Oshkosh had a very progressive group of women, and this is a slide of Sarah James. And Oshkosh had this group of women whose leadership was really quite remarkable. And this leadership spanned way beyond Oshkosh. It spanned way beyond Wisconsin. It spanned to Washington, D.C. And this group of women began to advocate that women should vote. They should be able to have a say. Now, we take it for granted today.
Absolutely.
I mean, we just take it for granted that women are going to be active in politics and that they can hold property and they can inherit wealth and they can make decisions. But it wasn't always the case. And we owe a lot to those women from Oshkosh that helped that take place. And Sarah James was a school teacher in town, but she was also very active in the women's suffrage movement. And she lobbied far and wide to try to get women the right to vote. And in this slide, it's Jessie Jack Cooper. Now, Jessie Jack Cooper was an incredible woman. Now, if there's one person in Oshkosh history that I would love to have met, it would have been Jessie Jack Cooper. She was really quite a woman. And she was wealthy, but that wealth enabled her to go to Washington and lobby in Washington and do the kind of things that have the influence to bring that thing to a vote, to bring that suffrage to a vote. Mm-hmm. And that painting that we just saw of Jessie Jack Cooper was actually done by an Oshkosh artist named Grenhagen, Merton Grenhagen. But there was a lot of artists that came from Oshkosh. Helen Farnsworth Mears is one example, and Helen Farnsworth Mears is the next slide. And she was an incredibly talented woman, very, very talented. The whole Mears family was talented. She lived a short life. She was born in the 1870s, 1874, and she died in 1916. Sadly, she died of the effects of malnutrition. But she was just this wonderfully artistic woman, and her talent was just incredible. And we have a number of things in the museum's collection. And there's actually a contest today that's named after her that encourages kids in school to explore their artistic talents. And so she's another leader of Oshkosh that we like to point to. A very, very wonderful woman. So the women really have had their role in leadership as well, and especially when to the women out there watching, the girls that are out there watching, I say that we're heirs to the successes and failures of people that came before us. Mm-hmm. Well, it's folks like Jessie Jack Hooper and Sarah James that we owe an incredible amount to. So now, turning back to our images, we're turning into the 20th century now. So now we're in the 20th century, and the river still was life for the city, but the log drives were coming to an end. The last log drive in Oshkosh was in 1911, and the focal point was still that place down by the Main Street Bridge. And that picture that we saw earlier of the Neff, well, this is the same image, but just taken much later.
Wow.
And that big tower that's in the back, that big round-looking thing, that's right about where the Leach Amphitheater is right now, and that was actually where they made liquefied gas. There was big coal piles there, and gas was the way that you lit your home in the days before electricity. So developing the Leach meant we had a brownfield there, and that's actually right where that is. But the river was still the focal point of life. Now, because Oshkosh had a pretty diverse industrial background, in our next slide, we see what is today called Oshkosh Corporation. It was originally Oshkosh Truck, or four-wheel drive truck, and it got its start around the time of World War I. And when it came to Oshkosh, it was actually started in Clintonville, but Oshkosh had this great workforce. It had its Germanic population had this incredible work ethic. We had the basis I mentioned earlier. When you think about the industries that sprang up around the wood industry, we had steam boilers and foundries and machinists and all those other things. Well, all those skills were easily transferable to the new automobile industry. So this new truck corporation said, Oshkosh is a great place to locate, and that's one of the things that brought them here, is the workforce and the skilled workforce and the work ethic. So Oshkosh was diversifying very early on, and its second real heyday was in the 1920s, where it was really, really strong in the 20s with all these different industries. In the number of leaders, or the number of people that came from Oshkosh, people of note that came from Oshkosh, continued in the 20th century. And in our next slide, we see a guy, his name is Lewis Hine. And that name may ring a bell to people, because Lewis Hine was the guy that took these famous photographs of immigrants at Ellis Island. He took the famous photographs of child labor that were taken primarily in New England. But the Hine family grew up in Oshkosh. They actually had a little cafe or a little restaurant on Main Street. And Lewis grew up in Oshkosh, and more than likely he either worked in a factory as a young boy, or he certainly would have experienced it, because the factories depended on child labor. All the factories, not just Oshkosh, not just in Wisconsin, but pretty much across the United States, they depended on child labor. And having kids around whirring machinery and having kids in a factory setting, we think of today as, well, gosh, that's not such a good idea. But in the 19th century, it was just a fact of life. It was just the way it was. We needed the money from the labor that those kids produced. And that no doubt influenced Louis Hine. And so as he started his career as a photographer, he probably drew on what he saw in Oshkosh growing up. And that's really one of the things that may have driven him to be this, what we now know as a very famous photographer. And the museum's collections actually hold the camera that he took,
Wow.
or that he used to take those famous photographs. And just kind of to wind up the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say, Louis Hine actually died penniless in New York City in 1940.
Wow.
So he didn't die a wealthy man. He actually died pretty much penniless.
Okay.
And then Oshkosh, the next image here, Oshkosh began changing in the Great Depression. The Depression was very, very tough on Oshkosh. It was really hard. A lot of those industries closed and there was very high unemployment. And it was really World War II that helped pull Oshkosh out of the Great Depression, just like it pulled out the nation out of the Great Depression.
Right.
It was really the war that pulled the nation out of the Depression. I'm certain, some of the other things like the Work Progress Administration may have helped, but it was really the war that did it. And the kind of the interesting thing is, Oshkosh was still important industrial at that time, and people were coming literally from all across the United States during the war to help. They were looking for information from Oshkosh's industrial leaders on how to increase production and how to make things. Now they could go to any place in the United States. They could go to Cincinnati, they could go to Pittsburgh, they could go to Boston, they could go to Philadelphia. But one of the places they wanted to come was Oshkosh. And in this slide, the slide here of a basketball team, I think it's a kind of a cool thing because when I tell people that in the late 1930s and around World War II, Oshkosh had a professional basketball team.
Right.
People are like, wow, had a professional basketball team? It was called the All-Stars. And they played actually just right near us, right on the other side here in the
South Park.
Yeah. So they played there, and it was really quite a cool thing. And of course, after World War II, things started changing, and it was the big cities that got the teams, and they were able to pay these phenomenal salaries. And basketball today is very, very different than it was in the 1940s. But at one time, Oshkosh had this great professional basketball team, which was very well known, and won the championship. So it's kind of a cool thing to be able to think about that when you think about your community and all the things that you should be proud of. That's one of the things I think is a cool thing to think about.
Okay.
And then next slide is an image of a conceptual drawing for the new leach plant that actually was built in the 1960s. And Oshkosh began changing in the 1950s and 1960s, and its traditional boundaries began expanding. And it began expanding first to the north. Actually, Murdoch was kind of the north boundary for decades and decades. Murdoch would have been kind of the north boundary of what we would consider to be Oshkosh. And beyond that was a little community called Nordheim, which was known as kind of a rough or tough neighborhood.
Right.
But that was the first area that the city of Oshkosh annexed. And one of the reasons it was annexed is because new industries were being built up there, Leach Company, that sort of thing. So when we think of Oshkosh expanding, we think today it's mainly expanding to the west, across on the other side of Highway 41, and that's where a lot of growth is. But really that first part of Oshkosh's post-World War II growth was to the north. It was there on the other side of Murdoch.
Okay.
So you take a look at that. And then the last thing, I would be remiss if I didn't actually talk about the museum and Edgar Sawyer. Edgar was the son of the senator that we looked at earlier, Felita Sawyer. And it was Edgar's leadership. Oshkosh benefited greatly from that. Edgar gave his house, that is now the public museum, he gave that as a gift to the community. And Edgar said, you can use that for whatever you want. It was valued at $250,000, which is like $3 million today. So it was just this very, very incredible gift. And they put together a group of citizens, and that group of citizens came with the recommendation that it become a public museum. So in our next slide, which is, I think, a good slide to end on, we are the preserver of the community's heritage. And when you start talking about leaders, and you talk about pride in the community, and you talk about the things that in the coming shows, which, by the way, I think is a great concept to talk about, what we are beneficiaries of in all these decisions and actions that have been made in the past. Think of the museum as the preserver or the holder of that. And in 2014, it's our 90th anniversary, and we'll be doing a lot of things on the 90th anniversary. So it's a pretty good point of pride that we like to end with this slide and help people think of the public museum. So that's my little overview there of the community.
Right. Well, that is absolutely fantastic. Do you have any questions of Brad?
Very, very insightful and very appreciative. I think our viewers are going to absolutely enjoy this.
Good.
Just, I guess, maybe if you can reflect on Oshkosh, all the great things it had in the past. One of the things as a representative of Oshkosh when I was on the council is, again, people comparing us to Appleton and whatnot. In your opinion, did Oshkosh slip from greatness? We were looked at as a potential capital for the state at one time. One of the bigger cities, and now we're not that. Are we just are we a victim of the industry changed from rivers where we were reliant on, and it just changed, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, everybody's going to have a different definition of greatness. I happen to think that Oshkosh is an incredibly good community to live, and I think maybe it's our perception of our residents and our citizens. Maybe we have this idea that we're not so good, but actually we are really good. We are really good. I mean, the fact that we have a university here.
Yeah.
I mean, there's other communities that don't have a university, and we have a Fox Valley Technical College, and we are a very strong community economically. And so I think that whole idea of are we good or are we great, it's how we perceive ourselves. And I would really encourage people to start having pride in their community and learn about their community and all the things that we've accomplished. And we have a lot of, I'll use that word great, we have a lot of great years ahead of us. I think I would really just encourage people to learn about their community. And instead of comparing us to other communities, let's focus on the way that we can all work together to make this an even better place to live. And I think our history can help us push us along a little bit.
Just maybe to close out here, I remember talking to the past finance director for Oshkosh, talking about a bunch of financial issues. And one of the things that is advantageous for Oshkosh is our credit rating. We have a very high credit rating. And I asked Peggy, why we have a great credit rating, and she says it's really primarily because of the community, the diverse community that we have, the different industries and whatnot, is the reason that we have that credit rating. So I think we can give ourselves a pat on the back with that.
Yeah, I think we should, and I think it's about time we do pat ourselves on the back.
Right. Well, Brad, we've got a couple minutes. We got to talk about the some volunteers we have here, but. Derek, I'm sure you want to thank Brad. It was very insightful.
Absolutely, Brad.
Just sat here and I just wanted to turn over to you and let you talk because it was great.
My pleasure.
Thank
you.
All right.
So what we're going to do now is that at the beginning of the show we talked about volunteers. Of course, without the volunteers, the show and all the other shows on Channel 2 would not be possible. Through the magic of television, we actually taped the first show on a different day. And Amanda could not be here at that time. So we're going to talk about Amanda. She's here. But right now we're going to talk about Ida Bentley. She is a volunteer on cameras. And there she is. Ida has 2 kids. She has a daughter, Grace, and a son, Nicholas. Ida lives in Neenah. And she is originally from Oshkosh. And she is she loves the history of Oshkosh. Ida did something that I've tried many, many times and failed every single time miserably. Ida has lost, believe this or not, 177 pounds And that is just an accomplishment that anyone that tried losing weight will tell you that it's about impossible. And she did that. So hats off to you, Ida. That is absolutely fantastic. She is a graduate of the dental assistant program. Her hobbies include photography, scrapbooking, camping, and biking. So Ida, thank you very much for being on board with us. And then finally, and last and certainly not least, is Amanda. She was a volunteer from the beginning, but Amanda was very sick a couple times and she could not make it. So she is the daughter of Daryl, who's in the control room, Daryl Dukacek. So Amanda, thank you very much for volunteering with us. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Derek, or not.
No, it's wonderful to have everybody aboard and making this show what it is. Great team effort and lots of wonderful episodes to come. So.
And with that, our next show will be with Scott Cross. He's an archivist at the, I don't know if it's archivist or archivist, I don't know, whatever it is,
take your pick.
at the museum. And he's going to be talking about Chief Oshkosh. You know, the show is about different things in Oshkosh, influential people. So Chief Oshkosh is certainly one of those, and we're going to start it off with him. So with that, unfortunately, we're out of time. On behalf of Derek and myself, thank you very much for watching, and tune in next time to another episode of Oshkosh Diaries. Thank you.
On the surface, the simple pleasures in life are going on all around us. But inches beneath the surface, utility lines are carrying electricity, gas, and more to your home. Digger's Hotline helps avoid costly or dangerous mistakes. It doesn't matter how deep you're digging. Call 811 or click diggershotline.com 3 working days before you start your project, and we'll help take the risk out of digging. Protect your simple pleasures. Know what's below.
There is a place where history is captured in time, where the voices of past generations still discuss the days of success, of love, hope, and joy. Timeless, playful,
Welcome to my attic.
memorable. The Oshkosh Public Museum. Come for the sights, stay for the memories.